Welcome back to Justice Reloaded HD, where the smallest moments often hold the greatest meaning. Let me ask you something simple. When was the last time you tucked someone in? Not because you had to, but because you cared. And when you did you pause, just for a second, to smile at how peaceful they looked? Tonight's story begins with a child, too cold to sleep, too quiet to ask for help, and a waitress who didn't walk past him. She didn't know his name. She didn't know who was watching. All she knew was that no one should ever have to shiver alone. If you believe that the gentlest love often shows up in the smallest acts, go ahead and like this video, and don't forget to subscribe to Justice Reloaded HD. We bring you stories each week, stories that don't just warm the heart, they help heal it. The diner sat quietly on the edge of a sleepy road in Asheville, North Carolina. Its wooden beams creaked faintly as the wind outside began to change. Autumn had slipped in softly that week, painting the trees in amber and rust. Inside, the smell of warm cornbread and chili hung in the air, and the heat lamps gave everything a gentle golden hue. Haley Brooks adjusted her apron behind the counter, rubbing her hands together to shake off the chill from her last trip to the walk-in freezer. It was a slow afternoon. The kind where you knew every face in the room, except the one that just walked in. She noticed them immediately. A man in a dark gray wool coat, collar turned up, face unreadable. And beside him, a boy. Small, fragile, with large brown eyes and pale skin that looked almost too thin for the weather. He walked stiffly, clutching a small plush blanket in one hand, the kind that had clearly seen too many wash cycles. His father guided him toward the booth near the window with a kind of quiet precision that came from doing things alone for a long time. Haley approached with her notepad, offering her usual warm smile. "Good afternoon. Can I get you both started with something warm?" The man, Henry Caldwell, though she didn't know that yet, barely looked up. "Coffee. Black. And whatever soup you have." She nodded, glancing at the boy, who had already slumped forward, resting his head on the cool tabletop. His shoulders trembled, almost imperceptibly. But Haley had seen that kind of trembling before. It wasn't just cold. It was exhaustion. And something deeper. She took their order and walked toward the kitchen, but paused at the employee coat rack tucked in the back hallway. Hanging there was a soft, oversized scarf, a backup left for emergencies. Without a word, Haley took it down and turned back. She moved with quiet care, stepping gently beside the boy. Henry was preoccupied, scrolling through something on his phone. He didn't notice. But Haley did. She leaned in and unfolded the scarf with practiced grace. Gently, she draped it over the boy's shoulders, letting the ends fall across his back like a whisper. She didn't say anything. She didn't need to. The boy, Lucas, didn't stir. But the trembling slowed. His breathing deepened. And there, in that moment of silence, a smile curled across his lips. Faint. Content. As if some part of him had been waiting for that warmth. Haley watched for just a second longer. Then she turned to walk away. But Henry had looked up. He hadn't meant to. Maybe it was instinct, or maybe something in the air shifted just enough to draw his gaze. His eyes fell on the scarf, on the stillness of his son, and for a moment he couldn't speak. No one had ever done that for Lucas. Not without being paid. Not without being told how. Not since his wife passed 6 years ago. That waitress hadn't asked for permission. She hadn't made a fuss. She just saw a cold child, and gave him warmth. And in that instant, something stirred in Henry Caldwell's chest. Something he hadn't felt in a long, long time. The next afternoon, the diner bell jingled again, but this time, it wasn't just another customer. Haley looked up from wiping the counter and stilled. It was the same man from yesterday. The older gentleman with the unreadable face and perfectly pressed coat. Only this time, he wasn't scanning the menu or checking his phone. He was looking directly at her. Their eyes met. "I need a moment," he said, voice low but firm. Haley nodded slowly and led him toward the far end of the counter, where the lunchtime buzz had quieted. There was no small talk. No pretense. "My son," he began, "has trouble sleeping." Haley said nothing, but her brow creased, the corners of her mouth softening. "He has a condition. His body doesn't regulate temperature well," Henry continued, "and he never sleeps without being covered properly. If the edges of the blanket aren't tucked just right, he'll stay awake for hours. It's been like that since he was a baby." There was a pause. A longer one. "But yesterday," he said, and for the first time, there was something behind the words. Not weakness, but wonder. "Yesterday, he slept. He didn't stir. Didn't flinch. Just rested. Peacefully." He looked at her again, really looked. "You didn't say anything. You didn't ask. You just covered him." Haley felt her throat tighten. She didn't expect praise. Especially not from a man like him. Henry cleared his throat, his tone now precise. "I'd like to offer you something. A few evenings a week. No heavy responsibilities. No medical care. Just come to the house, spend some time with Lucas before bed. Read him something. Sit with him. And tuck him in." The words hung in the air like a challenge disguised as a request. Haley blinked. I'm not a nanny." "I'm aware," he said evenly. "That's not what I'm asking for." She hesitated. It wasn't that she didn't care. But the thought of stepping into that quiet house, into someone else's grief, someone else's child, it felt like crossing an invisible line. She started to decline politely, but before the words could form, the bell above the diner door rang again. She turned instinctively toward the sound. Outside, through the streaked glass window, stood a small figure, Lucas. Barely visible behind the reflection of the sky. He stood beside the car, one hand pressed to the glass. In his arms, tucked carefully, was the very same scarf she had used the day before. It was folded. Neatly. Precisely. Haley's breath caught. That wasn't a coincidence. It wasn't random. It was a message. She looked back at Henry. He hadn't moved. He didn't plead. But the silence between them said more than words ever could. She gave a single nod. Not for the paycheck. Not for obligation. But because someone, maybe for the first time, had looked at something she did instinctively, and called it right. Even if it was just a scarf. Haley started coming by just after dinner, never too early to disrupt the family's routine, but always early enough to catch the last rays of sunset glinting through the Caldwell estate's wide front windows. She didn't arrive with fanfare, or with any special tools. Just her voice. And a sense of quiet patience that had somehow become the one thing Lucas seemed to crave. The first night, she brought a worn copy of Goodnight Moon. Her voice, soft and low, filled the bedroom like a lullaby that didn't need a melody. Lucas lay under his blanket, eyes wide but calm, as she read each word with care, pausing in just the right places, letting silence become part of the story. Then she tucked in the edges of his blanket, not tight, just enough. She smoothed the corners with the same touch she used for her brother years ago, when his body could no longer move, but his heart still needed warmth. That became their ritual. Each evening had its own rhythm. One night, she brought a story about trains, and Lucas insisted on making choo-choo sounds between pages. Another night, she challenged him to a blanket folding contest. Who could tuck the corners better? He always laughed when she purposely lost. Haley didn't just cover him with fabric. She taught him how to do it himself. How to pull one side gently, hold the edge, and tuck it just under his arm without letting it unravel. It took practice. But Lucas, for the first time in months, didn't mind trying. Because she made it fun. Because she made it safe. With every visit, the changes in Lucas grew more noticeable. The twitching before sleep became stillness. The anxious glances at the thermostat faded. The trembling hands now played games with blankets instead of clutching them in fear. And then one evening, out of nowhere, Lucas looked up at her and asked with a thoughtful seriousness that made Haley's breath catch. "Miss Haley, can you tuck in my dad too?" She blinked, unsure she heard him right. He looked down at his fingers. "He sleeps on the couch a lot. With no blanket. I think he gets cold." Haley didn't know what to say. She glanced toward the hallway, but Henry hadn't come up to check in yet. She smiled gently and said, "Maybe you could show him how to do it, like I showed you." Lucas nodded like it was the most obvious answer in the world. What Haley didn't know was that Henry had heard every word. He was standing just around the corner, out of sight. The evening news paused on the muted television behind him. He didn't say anything. Didn't interrupt. Later that night, after Lucas had fallen asleep and the house had grown quiet, Henry sat alone in his study. He turned on the security footage from the night before, not to check for safety, but for something else. He watched Haley enter the room, kneel beside his son, and lower the blanket with such gentleness, it almost looked choreographed. He paused the video when Lucas smiled up at her, not like a child looks at a babysitter, or even a favorite teacher. It was the way a child looks at someone who makes the world feel safe. Not because she fixed things, but because she stayed. The drawings began appearing on the fridge one by one, Lucas's little masterpieces made with crayon and construction paper. At first, they were simple, a stick figure with long brown hair beside a smaller figure wrapped in what looked like a big blue blanket. But soon, there were more details. A smile, a book in her hand, a soft chair by a window. And always, a blanket tucked neatly at the edge of the paper, drawn with almost obsessive care. Henry noticed them but didn't say much. Just a glance, a longer pause at the fridge door. One morning, he saw one labeled carefully in Lucas's uneven handwriting, "Me and Miss Haley playing tuck-in." That night, Haley brought a story about stars. Lucas loved it. After the last page, he turned to her with a smile that was unusually quiet. Thoughtful. "Do you think," he asked, voice small but serious, "if my mom was still alive, would she read stories like you do?" Haley blinked, caught off guard. She looked into the boy's wide eyes, so filled with curiosity and something deeper, something older than 7 years should carry. "I think," she said gently, "she would have read to you every night. And I think she would have made the best blanket forts." Lucas smiled, but his next words were a whisper. "Do you think her voice was warm like yours?" From the hallway, Henry heard every word. His breath caught in his throat. Lucas had never asked about his mother before, not like that. He was just a baby when she passed. A sudden illness, a terrible winter. Henry had buried his grief in work, in control, in routines that no one could question. But now, hearing his son ask a stranger if his mother's voice was warm, it shattered something deep inside him. Later that night, Henry called the housekeeper to his study. "Starting next week, Miss Brooks should only stay until story time ends," he said flatly. "No lingering. And she's not to overstep. No involvement in personal matters." The housekeeper hesitated. "Sir Lucas, he's been—" "I didn't ask for commentary," Henry snapped, then softened. "Just make it clear. Kindly." The next evening, Haley noticed the change. Lucas was still happy to see her, but the warmth in the house felt thinner, like someone had opened a window just enough to let the cold back in. After the story, as she folded the blanket, the housekeeper cleared her throat gently by the door. "Mr. Caldwell asks that we keep the evening schedule a bit shorter moving forward. Just to help with routine." Haley nodded slowly. She understood without needing more words. The line had been drawn. The next night, Lucas didn't laugh as loudly. He didn't ask for the blanket contest. He just listened quietly, then held onto her hand a little longer as she stood up to leave. Haley didn't say anything. But in her chest, a dull ache formed, one she hadn't expected. Not because her time had been cut, but because she could feel the little boy slipping back into silence. Into something colder than the air outside. Henry watched from the study window as she walked down the path that evening, her figure small beneath the porch light. He wanted to believe he was protecting his son. But deep down something told him. He'd just closed a door his child had finally dared to open. Winter came hard that year. The kind of cold that bit through even the thickest walls, settling into bones and memories. The Caldwell house, for all its grandeur, felt especially hollow that night, quiet, but not peaceful. Lucas had been sluggish all day. By evening, his cheeks flushed, his forehead burned to the touch, and he wouldn't eat. The house nurse was called in immediately. She moved quickly, professional, efficient, but the moment she tried to pull the comforter over him, Lucas shrieked. "No. No!" he cried, kicking and twisting under the blanket. "Don't touch it. Don't." The nurse tried again, gentler this time. Lucas slapped the covers away with trembling hands, his eyes wide with panic. The fever had taken hold, but something deeper was gripping him, something more than just a physical illness. Henry rushed into the room, tie half loosened, hair disheveled. "What's going on?" he demanded. "He's burning up," the nurse replied. "But he won't let me cover him. He needs to rest, he needs to sweat it out." "I'll do it," Henry said, his voice sharp. He knelt beside the bed, took the blanket slowly, and pulled it over his son's chest. Lucas's body stiffened. Then, like before, he shoved it off with a strength that startled both of them. "No. You're not her. You're not her," he sobbed, eyes glassy from fever and tears. Henry froze. "Lucas, it's me. It's Dad." But the boy wouldn't calm down. He trembled violently, his small hands clutching the thin edges of the sheet, as if fending off a ghost. Henry sat back on his heels, heart racing. He had commanded boardrooms, negotiated billion-dollar mergers. But at that moment, in that dimly lit bedroom with his fevered son, he was helpless. Without a word, he stood up and walked down the hall to his study. The security system had recorded every evening session. He told himself it was for safety, for accountability. But now, as he clicked through the footage, he searched for something else entirely. He found it in a clip from 2 weeks ago. The video showed Haley entering the bedroom, book in hand. She read softly, pausing every so often to ask Lucas a question, or to let him point to a picture. Then, when the story ended, she reached for the blanket, not with haste, but with reverence. She smoothed it once, twice, then leaned down. She kissed Lucas gently on the forehead. And then, almost inaudibly, she whispered something near his ear. "I'm not going anywhere. I'll still be here when you wake up." Lucas had smiled. His eyes had fluttered shut. And the blanket stayed on. Henry stared at the screen, the moment frozen. It wasn't just the act of tucking him in. It was how she did it. The presence. The promise. He looked at the monitor a long time, and finally understood. His son wasn't afraid of cold. He was afraid of being left alone while warm. Afraid that the person who covered him would vanish the second he drifted off. That night, Henry returned to Lucas's room. The nurse had stepped out for a moment, and the boy still writhed in half-sleep, murmuring, "Don't leave me." Henry sat beside him and lowered his voice. "I'm here," he said softly, pulling the blanket over Lucas again, slower this time. "I'm staying. No one's leaving." Lucas didn't respond with words. But this time, he didn't resist the warmth. And when his breathing finally steadied, Henry sat there in silence, watching over the boy who, for all his fragility, had taught him something stronger than control. Love is staying. The community library smelled faintly of old paper and warm wood. It was quiet except for the soft clatter of books being returned and the occasional murmur of a child asking where the dragon stories were. Haley stood behind the front desk, sliding barcodes over the scanner with a kind of rhythm that came from years of humble jobs and quiet patience. She wasn't expecting to see him again. But when she looked up, and saw Henry Caldwell standing in the doorway, coat still buttoned, eyes softer than she remembered, she didn't reach for her name tag. She didn't say welcome. She just stood still, one hand resting on a paperback copy of Charlotte's Web. Henry walked toward her slowly, like a man who had rehearsed something and then forgot all the words. He didn't carry flowers. He didn't carry an apology. He carried a scarf. The same scarf. Folded perfectly, creased at the corners, soft with use. The one she had wrapped around Lucas that first day in the diner. The one Lucas had clung to, then hidden under his pillow. He held it out to her, not like an offering, but like a return. Haley looked at it, then at him. No one spoke. Henry cleared his throat, but still didn't lift his eyes. He kept it. Every night. Under his pillow. Said it was the warmest thing in the house. She swallowed gently, emotions rising like quiet waves. She hadn't heard Lucas's name in days. Not since she was asked to leave early, not since the nights grew colder without explanation. Henry finally looked up. I thought protecting him meant building walls. Keeping things controlled. Predictable. Safe. His voice wasn't shaky, but there was something worn in it, like a man admitting the weight he'd carried too long. But I watched you, and I saw something else. He took a breath, and his next words were softer. You didn't build a wall. You sat beside him and pulled the blanket up when it slipped. Again and again. And he slept. Because he knew, you'd still be there when he woke. Haley held the scarf now, her fingers tracing the fibers like they held memories. He continued, I thought I was giving him everything by keeping the world out. But you showed me. Sometimes what a child needs isn't a fortress. He paused. Then spoke the words that hadn't left him since the night Lucas burned with fever. Sometimes, he just needs someone patient enough to pull the blanket back up when it falls. The library buzzed faintly with a copier in the distance, but at the desk, it was still. Haley didn't smile. Not yet. She just nodded gently, the way someone does when they recognize a truth they've carried but never heard out loud. Henry's voice steadied. I know this isn't your job anymore. And I have no right to ask. But Lucas, he asks about you every night. And he stopped, then added, I think he sleeps lighter without you. Haley looked at him then, not the billionaire, not the man in the tailored coat, but the father. And in his eyes, for the first time, she saw something vulnerable. Not just regret, but willingness. Willingness to change. She folded the scarf once more, tucked it into her bag, and said softly, Tell him I'll see him tomorrow. And just like that she returned, not as a waitress, not as an employee, but as someone who had shown a child how to feel safe again, and a father how to love without control. Sometimes, healing doesn't come with fanfare. Sometimes it just walks back in through the front door, quietly, bringing warmth with it. The event hall was modest but filled with warmth. Twinkling lights hung from the rafters, soft music floated through the air, and rows of chairs were packed with families, counselors, and quiet children clutching stuffed animals or holding tight to a parent's hand. A banner stretched across the back of the stage read, Cover me, because no child should sleep alone in fear. At the center of it all stood three people. Henry Caldwell, no longer just a man of industry, now wore the face of a father who had learned, painfully humbly, what protection really meant. Beside him stood Haley, in a simple navy dress, her hands clasped in front of her, eyes always scanning the crowd for the ones who looked nervous, lost, cold. And between them, standing on a wooden box behind the podium so he could reach the microphone, was Lucas. The little boy looked down at his note card, then up at the sea of expectant faces. His voice, when it came, was small, but steady. I used to be scared of going to sleep. A hush fell over the room. I thought, if I closed my eyes, the person who tucked me in might be gone when I woke up. He looked to his right, where Haley stood. She gave him the tiniest nod. But then someone taught me, he continued, that the blanket isn't what makes you warm. He paused. It's knowing someone will be there, to pull it back up if it falls off. A ripple moved through the audience, shoulders lifted, hands touched faces, a few sniffles filled the space. Lucas smiled faintly. That's why my dad and Miss Haley started this program. So kids like me, especially kids who lost someone, can have a blanket, a book, and a person who cares. Even if it's just for a little while. He stepped back, letting the applause swell. Henry placed a hand gently on his son's shoulder, pride brimming in his eyes, but quiet, as if too much would break the moment. Haley didn't move toward the spotlight. She didn't need to. She stood just behind them, steady and still. The same way she had stood beside Lucas on all those nights, off stage, but never out of reach. As the room rose in a standing ovation, Lucas leaned slightly toward her and whispered, "Did I say it right?" Haley knelt beside him and tucked a loose corner of his jacket around his back. "You said it perfectly," she said, her voice catching just a little. "And you reminded everyone of something very important." Lucas grinned. "That no one's really alone, if someone stays." She smiled back, and for a moment, it felt like the whole room exhaled. They hadn't just launched a program. They'd started something bigger, something stitched together not with fabric, but with presence, patience, and the promise that no matter how cold the world might feel, someone would always be there to pull the blanket back up. If you believe that a blanket can warm more than just the body, please give this video a like. And don't forget to subscribe to Justice Reloaded HD to keep following more heartfelt stories every week. Thank you for watching until the end. We'll see you next time.